A Bretton Woods legacy birth of the IMF and World Bank. The year is 1944. World War II is nearing its end, leaving behind a world in desperate need of reconstruction and stability. Delegates from 44 nations gather in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, with a shared vision for a new economic order. Their mission to rebuild a world shattered by war and prevent future economic turmoil, ensuring peace and prosperity for generations to come. From this historic meeting, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank emerged, marking a new era in global financial cooperation. The IMF was tasked with ensuring global financial stability, primarily by providing short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments crises, helping them stabilize their economy. The World Bank, initially known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, focused on long-term lending for reconstruction and development projects, aiming to rebuild infrastructure and promote economic growth. These institutions were born from the ashes of war, carrying the hope of a more stable and prosperous world, where nations could collaborate for mutual benefit. However, the world they were designed to serve was far from equal, with vast disparities in wealth and power. The global power dynamics of the post-war era, heavily influenced by the victors of the war, were embedded in the DNA of these institutions, shaping their policies and priorities. The United States, with its dominant economic and political clout, held and continues to hold significant sway in both the IMF and World Bank, often steering their agendas. This power imbalance laid the groundwork for criticisms that would challenge the legitimacy and effectiveness of these institutions for decades to come, sparking debates about their true impact. The initial focus of the World Bank was on rebuilding war-torn Europe, providing the necessary funds to restore infrastructure and revive economies. This shifted in the following decades towards development projects in newly decolonized nations, primarily in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, aiming to support their economic independence and growth. The IMF, meanwhile, played a crucial role in managing the global monetary system, overseeing the fixed exchange rate regime that prevailed until the early 1970s, ensuring currency stability. Despite their initial goals of promoting global economic stability and development, the IMF and World Bank would soon become the subjects of intense scrutiny and criticism, facing backlash from various quarters. Their policies, often accused of being insensitive to local contexts and prioritizing the interests of wealthy nations, raised concerns about their true impact on the developing world, questioning their effectiveness. The stage was set for a decades-long debate about the role, influence, and accountability of these powerful financial institutions, a debate that continues to this day.
Voting power and representation, the unheard voices of the Global South. A fundamental criticism leveled against both the IMF and the World Bank centers on their governance structures, which many argue are outdated and inequitable. These institutions operate on a weighted voting system, where a country's voting power is determined by its economic size and financial contribution, creating a significant imbalance. This system inherently favors wealthy nations, particularly the United States, which holds veto power over major decisions within both institutions, effectively controlling the agenda. This weighted voting structure has resulted in a stark underrepresentation of developing countries, often referred to as the Global South, who find their voices marginalized. Despite being the primary recipients of IMF and World Bank loans and policies, these countries have limited influence in shaping the decisions that directly impact their economies and citizens, leading to policies that may not align with their needs. This democratic deficit undermines the legitimacy of these institutions and perpetuates a system where the needs and priorities of the Global South are often sidelined, creating a cycle of dependency and frustration. Critics argue that this power imbalance has resulted in a form of neo-colonialism, where economic control is exerted through financial mechanisms rather than direct political rule. Economic policies are often seen as being imposed on developing countries rather than being formulated through a process of genuine partnership and consultation, leading to policies that may not be effective or sustainable. The lack of meaningful representation for the Global South fuels resentment and distrust towards these institutions, hindering their ability to effectively address global economic challenges and creating a barrier to cooperation. Calls for reform within the IMF and World Bank have persistently demanded a more equitable distribution of voting power, emphasizing the need for a fairer system. Greater representation for developing countries is seen as essential for ensuring that these institutions are truly representative of the global community they claim to serve and for fostering a sense of ownership and accountability. However, resistance from powerful member states, particularly those who benefit from the current system, has hindered progress towards meaningful reform in this area, leaving the status quo largely intact.
The price of assistance: eroding sovereignty through conditionalities. One of the most contentious aspects of the IMF and World Bank's lending practices is the concept of conditionalities. These are conditions attached to loans, often requiring borrowing countries to implement specific economic policies as a prerequisite for receiving financial assistance. These policies can range from fiscal austerity measures to comprehensive economic reforms. These policies, collectively known as structural adjustment programs, have been a cornerstone of the IMF and World Bank's approach to development for decades. They are designed to stabilize economies, reduce fiscal deficits, and promote growth.
While presented as a pathway to economic stability and growth, structural adjustment programs have been widely criticized for their detrimental impact on developing countries. Critics argue that these programs often prioritize financial stability over social welfare. These programs typically mandate austerity measures such as cuts to public spending, privatization of state-owned enterprises, trade liberalization, and deregulation. Such measures are intended to create a more market-friendly environment. Critics argue that these policies often exacerbate poverty and inequality by undermining social safety nets, increasing unemployment, and leading to the closure of local businesses that cannot compete with international corporations, and reducing access to essential services like healthcare and education. The cuts in public spending often mean that the most vulnerable populations suffer the most. Moreover, the imposition of conditionalities raises serious concerns about national sovereignty. The ability of a nation to make independent economic decisions is compromised. Critics argue that these programs effectively transfer economic decision-making power from democratically elected governments to unelected officials in Washington, D.C. This shift can lead to policies that do not reflect the will or needs of the local population. This can undermine democratic processes and erode public trust in national governments, creating a disconnect between the government and its citizens, potentially leading to social and political instability. The unrest can manifest in protests, strikes, and even riots, further destabilizing the country. The perception of these institutions as imposing a one-size-fits-all approach to development, without adequately considering the unique circumstances of each country, further fuels resentment and resistance. Each nation has its own cultural, social, and economic context that may not align with the prescribed policies.
The debate over conditionalities lies at the heart of the ongoing critique of the IMF and World Bank. This debate is not just academic, it has real-world implications for millions of people. While proponents argue that these conditions are necessary to ensure responsible lending and promote economic reforms, they believe that without such measures, financial aid could be misused or lead to further economic mismanagement. Critics view them as a form of economic coercion that undermines national sovereignty and perpetuates a cycle of debt and dependency. They argue that these policies often benefit the lending institutions more than the borrowing countries, trapping them in a cycle of debt.
A. History of double standards, inconsistent decision-making, and bias. Beyond the structural issues of voting power and conditionalities, the IMF and World Bank have also faced accusations of inconsistent decision-making and bias. Critics point to instances where these institutions appear to apply different standards to different countries, often favoring those with closer political or economic ties to powerful member states. Examples of this alleged bias abound. Some argue that the IMF's response to the 1997 Asian financial crisis was unduly harsh, imposing strict austerity measures on countries like Thailand and South Korea that exacerbated the economic downturn. In contrast, the institution's handling of the 2008 global financial crisis, which originated in the United States, was seen as more lenient, prioritizing bailouts for large financial institutions. This perceived double standard undermines the credibility of the IMF and World Bank as impartial actors in the global economy. it reinforces the view that these institutions are ultimately driven by the interests of powerful nations rather than by a genuine commitment to global economic stability and development. The lack of transparency in decision-making processes within both institutions further fuels suspicions of bias. Critics argue that the closed-door nature of negotiations and the limited access to information make it difficult to hold these institutions accountable for their actions. To address these concerns, there have been growing calls for greater transparency and accountability within the IMF and World Bank. This includes demands for open and inclusive decision-making processes, greater access to information, and independent mechanisms for investigating allegations of bias and misconduct.
In recent years, Kenya has faced significant economic challenges attributed to the policies and conditionalities imposed by the IMF and World Bank. These institutions have been criticized for prioritizing debt repayment over essential public services, leading to austerity measures that have adversely affected the Kenyan population. In Nairobi, the hustle and bustle of the city is juxtaposed with the harsh realities faced by many of its residents. The rising cost of living has become a daily struggle for families, with increased taxes and reduced government spending on healthcare and education exacerbating the situation. Meet Jane, a mother of 3. Jane's voice represents countless Kenyans as she shares her story. "I used to be able to afford basic necessities for my children. Now, with the cost of everything going up, it's a constant battle to make ends meet. The government used to provide better support, but now even healthcare is a luxury." These austerity measures, driven by the need to meet debt repayment conditions set by the IMF and World Bank, have sparked widespread debates. Critics argue that the focus on debt repayment comes at the expense of the well-being of the Kenyan people. The reduction in government spending on essential services has left many without access to adequate healthcare and education, further entrenching poverty and inequality. Economic experts in Kenya highlight the need for a more balanced approach. "We need to find a way to manage our debt without sacrificing the basic needs of our population," says Dr. Mwangi, an economist at the University of Nairobi. "The current policies are unsustainable and are causing more harm than good." The ongoing debates surrounding the roles of the IMF and World Bank in Kenya's economic landscape raise important questions about the priorities of these financial institutions. Are they genuinely committed to fostering sustainable development, or are they primarily focused on ensuring debt repayment at any cost? As the Kenyan government and its citizens grapple with these challenges, the need for greater transparency and accountability from the IMF and World Bank becomes increasingly evident. The voices of those affected by these policies must be heard, and their stories must inform the future direction of these institutions' involvement in the country's economic affairs. In the next scene, we will explore potential solutions and alternative approaches to addressing these economic challenges, focusing on how Kenya and other countries in the global south can achieve sustainable growth and development without compromising the well-being of their citizens.